I got 8 players who everyone else is afraid to draft but could deliver fantasy championships in 2024. It's hard to find legit discounts in Underdog fantasy drafts these days. Drafters are sharp, the ADP market is generally efficient, wide receivers and rookies are more expensive than they've ever been. And yet, if you dig hard enough, you can find a handful of mispriced players who can help us unlock super teams. I'm Pete Overzet, this is the Deposit Kingdom, and these are the discounted league winners that you'll need to create super teams that dominate in the fantasy playoffs. Almost every piece of strategy advice we talk about on this channel boils down to the same simple concept. The fantasy playoffs are all that matter in these top-heavy underdog fantasy tournaments. We don't even need to debate week 17 versus week 16 again. We've already done that. Or even week 15, because we should be able to all agree on the fact that the fantasy playoffs are all that matters. Think about it this way. There are 4 rounds in most of these traditional best ball tournaments on Underdog. Round 1 is weeks 1 through 14. That's the regular season. Round 2 is week 15. Round 3 is week 16. And round 4 is week 17. So while 82%, 14 of the 17 weeks, come in the regular season, 75% of the contests, 3 of the 4 mini tournaments, come in weeks 15 through 17. And for the most part, the field is getting better and better at optimizing their rosters to field the strongest possible team for the final 3 rounds of the tournament. They've embraced zero RB, which benefits from the chaos throughout the season. They've now embraced stacking up games in week 17 to compete for the top prizes. But they are still scared to draft players who are likely to miss time at the beginning of the season. This is likely a mistake, depending, of course, on how big of a discount we are getting, because the production at the beginning of the season is the least important. Not only are our teams the healthiest they will be all season long at the beginning, but the bye weeks have barely started. This is the one time during the fantasy season that we won't miss their production. With that said, here are 8 discounted players in drafts and whether you should be drafting them at their current ADPs. First up, we got Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver Rashee Rice. He's got an ADP of 70. So why is he discounted? Well, pull up a chair. How much time do you have? It's been a brutal offseason for Rashee Rice's value after he ended the 2023 season as the Chiefs' de facto wide receiver 1. He then opened up as a 2-3 turn pick in early big board drafts, but poor off-field decisions by Rice, and that is putting it mildly, as well as the Chiefs adding both Hollywood Brown in free agency and Xavier Worthy in the NFL draft, have pushed Rashee Rice down into the 6th and 7th round over the past month. The biggest reason for Rice's fall is the looming suspension risk for an incident where Rice was driving 116 miles per hour and involved in a hit and run that left 4 people injured. He's now facing 8 felonies in Texas and a criminal case, and nearly everyone agrees a suspension is coming at some point, but the duration of the suspension and when it will be handed down remain very much in question. If there were no suspension risk, Rashee Rice would be going right around Zay Flowers and T. Higgins at the 3-4 turn. So we are getting an almost 3-round discount due to the suspension ambiguity. So how do we play this? Rashee Rice is a priority target in drafts right now and one of the true bargains at wide receiver on the entire board. The trial for Rice's criminal case isn't even set yet, and we know from previous cases how long it can take for the wheels of justice to get spinning. For reference, Alvin Kamara's incident involving a physical altercation took place in February 2022, and his 3-game suspension wasn't announced until the following year in August of 2023. Underdog's Hayden Winks, who dug into the situation, gave his best guess on the suspension recently, and he handicapped it like this: 40% chance of exactly 6-game suspension, 20% chance at more than 6 games, 20% less than 6 games, and 20% odds for 0 games missed in 2024. I agree with those ballparks, which means 80% of the time, Rice is suspended for 6 games or less. Let's go back to how we're viewing this tournament in these 4 chunks. 6 games of the regular season represents 42% of the regular season and only 10% of the total tournament. The TLDR is it won't be hard to survive his lack of production at the beginning of the season when it matters the least. Rice is a priority target because he fits on virtually any build, either a high upside wide receiver 5 or 6 on a 0 RB build, or an upside piece in a heavy running back or elite onesie start where you build out a ton of wide receiver depth behind him. Next up, we got running back Jonathon Brooks from Carolina, ADP of 87. The rookie out of Texas tore his ACL on November 11th and then landed in an unsexy landing spot with the Carolina Panthers, which has caused his ADP to settle in the 8th and 9th rounds for most of the summer. Now, rookies are often the cohort that are most discounted relative to the back-weighted production they provide, so we are essentially getting a double discount on Brooks for both the injury and the landing spot. The team has been non-committal on whether Brooks would be ready for the start of training camp, which is placing seeds of doubt in drafters' minds. If there were zero injury concerns on Brooks, he likely would have gone even higher in the real NFL draft, and had he landed on the Cowboys or Chargers, he would have been a 4th-round pick. Still, even on the Panthers, we are getting a discount because the market is assuming a slow start to the season. We saw a similar dynamic play out last year with Breece Hall. The team telegraphed a slow start. They brought in Dalvin Cook, and they didn't fully unleash Hall until week 6. And no one missed that early season production. If there were no slow start concerns, Brooks would be going 2 rounds earlier in the Kenneth Walker, Rachaad White, and Joe Mixon range. So how do we play it? Similar to Rice, I think Brooks is one of the best picks on the board. His ADP falls nicely at the top of the running back sweet spot, right after the wide receiver talent starts to fall off a cliff. He perfectly fits wide receiver heavy builds as part of a 0 RB room, or he can be the RB4 in a hyper fragile build where you need big upside from your final back. Initially, I had concern about taking too much Brooks at these prices in case the market double counts him opening up on training camp pup. That does seem likely, and that would push him further down the board. But the more I think about it, there's just so much to like here from a late season hammer perspective that I think you want to be packing Brooks bags all summer at ADP and then be ready to buy the dip hard if he slips further. We saw what Dave Canales was able to do with Rachaad White in Tampa last year, and then he went out and handpicked Brooks to be his guy in Carolina. It's fair to worry about Brooks' explosiveness in year 1 off the ACL, but his college profile, the pass-catching chops, and a path to dominate touches give him plenty of outs to smash this ADP with late-season spikes. It would shock no one if Brooks is a 2nd-round pick in 2025 drafts, and if he is, it'll be because he smashed down the stretch in a much-improved Panthers offense. Next up, quarterback Justin Fields in Pittsburgh, ADP of 211. When we made our 12 most polarizing players in fantasy football video back in April, Justin Fields was number 1 on the list. At the time, his ADP was 167, but he's now slid all the way to pick 211 and often goes undrafted, which is a much more appropriate price for his risk-reward profile. He's discounted for a very simple and obvious reason. The Steelers have made it very clear that Russell Wilson will start, and the market is not convinced he'll ever give it up to Fields. Now, if we knew Fields was starting for 17 games, I feel very confident he'd be going in the 6th and 7th round of drafts, right around CJ Stroud and Kyler Murray. As we can see from the RotoViz range of outcomes tool, we know his ceiling is sky high from a fantasy standpoint, with high-end comps to Lamar Jackson and early career Cam Newton. And even if we were guaranteed that Fields would play in, say, the final 4 to 5 weeks of the season, he would easily be going in round 14 or 15 near Baker Mayfield, Deshaun Watson, and Aaron Rodgers. But because we have zero guarantees, he's now a selection you can regularly make with your last pick in round 18. Now, there's a couple ways to view Fields' likelihood to play this year. On the one hand, the entire NFL showed us they are completely out on him by no one giving up anything remotely of value to take a chance on him. So we have to be honest with ourselves that he's likely a bad QB, even if he can be a fantasy superstar. On the other hand, understanding the pick swap that the Steelers made for Fields gives us some strong hints on how to play this. Here's what we said back in April. In the trade, Chicago received a 2025 6th-round pick that converts to a 4th-round selection if Fields plays 51% of the snaps this season. This means if you're the Steelers, it would make sense for Fields to get action late in the season because 1, it doesn't trigger the 4th-round selection, and 2, they can see if he's ready for the starting gig in 2025. And that means if we do see Fields, it will be when it matters the most for our fantasy teams in the fantasy playoffs, and because people do forget that week 17 is all that matters. I've been drafting a good bit of Fields almost exclusively in 3 quarterback builds. He's tougher to pull off in 2 QB builds because if he doesn't play until the end of the season, it's the equivalent of having your second quarterback on bye every single week. And we know how much that can hurt our advance rates from both the bye week work done by Neil Farley and Mike Leone's manifesto work that shows how those zeros submarine your advance rates. Be sure to check out our video that's a comprehensive guide on how to tackle Best Ball Mania. If you guys haven't yet, we explore some of those concepts in that video. My favorite way to draft Fields is really simple. It's under 2 conditions. When I have 2 statue quarterbacks with limited single game upside, say Derek Carr and Matthew Stafford. And then when I also have another Steelers piece on my team and can lean into that correlation. Fields will not make sense for every team you draft, and it's unlikely he gets more expensive, so you can wait to pack your bags in August. But from the zoomed out view, if he plays in the fantasy playoffs or takes over earlier than expected, we will look back on Fields as the single most mispriced player in fantasy football. I'm willing to take cracks on that when my team needs a third upside option at quarterback. Next up, we have tight end TJ Hockenson in Minnesota, ADP of 148. We are now getting into the players coming off serious injuries late in the season, which means we need to be even more critical about how much of a discount we need to take the plunge. Hockenson tore his right ACL and MCL in week 16 late in the 2023 season and didn't have surgery until January 29th. It's worth driving home that this wasn't a clean ACL tear, but rather a complex multi-ligament knee tear. Typical recovery for this type of injury is at least 9 months, which means he's a virtual lock to start the season on PUP and miss at least the first half of the season, which is why the market is approaching him with kid gloves. Hockenson was the tight end 3 off the board in 2023 behind only Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, and he's now regularly sliding into the 13th and 14th round of drafts. If we were getting a full 17 games from Hockenson, he'd likely be going at the end of the elite tight end tier around George Kittle. And when you consider his range of outcomes, which we can see here from the RotoViz tool, he's second behind only Travis Kelce for 2024. Now, the tool doesn't know about the quarterback change, which I assume the market is factoring in a bit here as well, but the potential for a late season hammer here is possible. It also doesn't hurt that the Vikings have 2 home dome games in the playoffs. So how I'm thinking about this, like Fields, he is tricky to play in drafts. The natural instinct is to want to pair him with an elite tight end, but that also means you'll only have 1 tight end each week for most of the regular season, which we just said is not ideal for advance rates. I'd prefer to play Hockenson similar to Fields as part of a triple onesie strategy. You can then treat him similar to a guy like Isaiah Likely, who is a pure contingent play. Similar to Fields, I only want to use Hawk in specific scenarios, but if he 1, falls past ADP, and 2, you need an upside tight end in a 3 tight end build, he is firmly on the menu because of his proven upside. Nick Chubb is the other high-profile superstar being discounted because of a second massive injury he suffered last season in week 2. He ended up needing 2 surgeries to repair his MCL and meniscus and another to repair his ACL. He's now a little over 7 months out from the second surgery last September and was recently seen making great progress with his rehab.
Move. Hold contact.
Although I'm not sure that dispels the criticisms that he only has 1 good leg now. Nevertheless, before this update, most Twitter docs have suspected him returning in the second half of the season and ramping up from there. But drafters are certainly worried that he'll be able to deliver big spike weeks even when he does return. Now, if Nick Chubb were completely healthy, he'd be going in the 3rd round next to Derrick Henry, but that's not the case. If you knew for a fact that Chubb would be fully healthy with no limitations for the fantasy playoffs, you could make the case for him in round 10 or 11 range, which would make him a smash pick relative to where he's going now. But similar to Hockenson, we can't guarantee any of this. Chubb is a really tricky bet, mainly because of the opportunity cost and the fact that there's no guarantee he returns to his old form in 2024. When I look at the running backs going around him, Zach Charbonnet, Rico Dowdle, Kendre Miller, Marshawn Lloyd, Ty Chandler, all of those guys have paths to both standalone value and massive contingent upside out of the gate, which makes it really hard to select Chubb over him. When Chubb does fall, though, into the 150s alongside more fringe bets like Jalen Wright, Jaleel McLaughlin, and Kamani Vidal, he becomes a buy for me because all of those backs have the risk of being a zero during the season, so you aren't sacrificing as much at those prices. Let's do some quick hitters on the other discounted players because of injury. These guys are mostly free in drafts and can make sense in certain situations, but I don't want to be overweight on any of these guys, especially this early in the offseason. We'll start with J.K. Dobbins on the Los Angeles Chargers. He's played just 9 games in the last 3 seasons and is coming off a torn Achilles in Week 1 versus the Texans. On top of that, the Chargers gave him basically no money. All that said, the reports out of Chargers camp are very positive, though, with NFL insider Daniel Jeremiah saying he's going to be a fantasy factor this year. Do with that what you will. Dobbins isn't completely free with an ADP in the 180s, but I like that he's the cheapest of the 3 Chargers backs getting drafted. And when we look at the RotoViz range of outcomes tool, you can see his high, mid, and low projections are nearly identical to the much more expensive Gus Edwards. I don't mind sprinkling Dobbins in, especially if Vidal doesn't generate much buzz over the next month. Next up, we have Ravens running back Keaton Mitchell, who tore his ACL in Week 17, and the team has already confirmed he won't be ready for Week 1. He's now free in most drafts. I'm not currently drafting him because I think there's just much better late-round running back selections, but if we get positive news about his rehab in August, I'll start to sprinkle him in. And then finally, we do have Saints tight end Juwan Johnson. He suffered a more recent foot injury, and the subsequent surgery was reported on June 13, but the team insists he'll be ready for Week 1. So considering he's now going undrafted in a lot of contests, I think he's a great pick if you need a tight end 3 or are looking to double stack Derek Carr. In reviewing all of these discounted players, my biggest takeaway is that each player needs to be approached in a unique way. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Rashee Rice and Jonathon Brooks are the clear exceptions as they're screaming targets. They both can work in a variety of builds, and I would continue to draft both of them at or above ADP. Justin Fields and the rest of the injured players require more nuance. I want to be extremely price sensitive on these guys and almost exclusively draft them when they fall past ADP or into a range where there is little opportunity cost. I also want to be sure they fit well on a given team, which means they're correlated with the other pieces I've already drafted and that they're paired with fast start players who can help the team survive their lack of early season production. You can mix and match the back-weighted guys that we've talked about today with players you know will produce early in the season, essentially creating a pass the baton dynamic as the team progresses throughout the season. Thanks to both RotoViz's Michael Dubner and David Felipe for their help researching this video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more in-depth strategy videos on best ball and all of these tournaments. I'm Pete Overzet. We'll see you guys next time.